In the wet gray autumn of 2003, 26-year-old Cecily Bouchard inherited the silence of her grandfather's 400 acres of exhausted Saskatchewan wheatland. She inherited the listing barn with its warped doors that swung open in the wind at 3 in the morning. She inherited the John Deere that leaked hydraulic fluid onto the gravel like a slow wound. She inherited the smell of the farmhouse, wood smoke and old paper, and something underneath it all that she could only describe as defeat. But most importantly, she inherited his notebooks. Not a journal exactly. Her grandfather, Rémy Bouchard, had never been a man of dramatic declarations. What he left behind was a series of ordinary spiral-bound notebooks, the kind you bought at the co-op for 99 cents, filled in his cramped, slanting French with observations most people would have thrown away: the temperature on a given morning, the color of the sky before rain, how the runoff water moved through the low fields after a thaw, how certain patches of ground smelled different from others, how one stretch along the north fence line, untouched for 20 years, had soil so dark it looked almost black, while the rest of the cultivated land was the pale, drained gray of old dishwater. Cecily had grown up spending summers on this land. She remembered walking that north fence line with him when she was 10 or 11, her rubber boots sinking into the soft ground there, while the rest of the farm crunched underfoot. She had asked him why it was different. He had crouched down, picked up a handful of that dark soil, and held it out to her. It felt different even then, heavier, almost alive between her fingers, the way good bread dough feels compared to flour. "Ce champ-là se repose," he had told her. "This field is resting." She hadn't thought much about it until she found the notebooks. The men at the grain elevator in Melfort said the same thing they always said. The land was worn out. 30 years of continuous wheat had taken everything. The answer was inputs: commercial nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, a proper fertility program. Her grandfather had gone light on inputs in his last years, either out of stubbornness or poverty, and the yields had suffered for it. The numbers were right there in the elevator records. If she wanted to see them, they showed her, patient and not unkind, the steady decline across the last decade. The solution was straightforward: get financing. Get on a proper fertility program. Get back in the game. Cecily stood at the edge of the worst field and listened to them. Then she drove home and opened the notebook from 1987. Her grandfather had written something in the margin of a page about soil temperature. It was a single sentence, underlined twice, in the particular emphatic way he used when he was arguing with himself. "The wheat is hungry, but the ground is hungrier. We keep feeding one and starving the other." She read that sentence for a long time. Then she went to the north fence line. She dug down 6 inches with a hand trowel and looked at what came up. It was dark. It was loose. She could see the white threads of fungal hyphae running through it like frost on glass. She brought a handful to her nose. It smelled the way she remembered: deep, faintly sweet, like something alive and slow and sure of itself. 20 years of rest. 20 years of grass and clover and weeds doing what they do when nobody stops them. Building something. She took samples from 4 locations across the farm and drove them to the University Extension Office in Saskatoon. The results came back 3 weeks later. The numbers told a stark story. The cultivated fields had organic matter content of less than 1%. pH was off. Microbial activity was negligible. The soil was, in the clinical language of the report, biologically depleted. But the north fence line sample, the untouched strip, had organic matter of 4.2%. Microbial activity rated as high. The report noted, almost as an aside, that the untouched sample appeared to contain a healthy lupulin of mycorrhizal fungi. She read that word twice. Mycorrhizal. She looked it up. What she found changed everything. Now, let me explain something that most people, most farmers even, didn't fully understand in 2003, and that the agronomy industry had very little financial incentive to explain. Beneath a healthy prairie, there is an invisible network. Fungi attach themselves to plant roots and extend filaments outward through the soil for meters in every direction, trading minerals and water with the plants in exchange for sugars. They connect plants to each other. They build soil structure by binding particles together with a sticky protein called glomalin. They are, in every meaningful sense, the immune system and the digestive system and the nervous system of the land all at once. And they are destroyed, not reduced, not weakened, but destroyed by tillage and synthetic nitrogen. The tillage physically shreds the networks. The synthetic nitrogen makes the plants lazy. They stop feeding the fungi because they don't need to, and the fungi die from starvation. Every year of conventional cropping, you are making a withdrawal from an account you didn't know existed, until one day the account is empty and the bank is closed. Her grandfather had watched this happen. He hadn't had the vocabulary for it, but he had seen the pale fields and the dark fence line and understood, on some level that was older than words, that rest was not weakness. Rest was accumulation. Cecily had a plan. It was not a modest one. She would stop tilling. She would stop synthetic fertilizer entirely. She would seed the worst fields down to a diverse cover crop mix. Legumes for nitrogen fixation, grasses for root mass, brassicas for deep tillage with no steel involved. She would run her 60 head of beef cattle in a rotation across the land in tight, short bursts, mimicking, as best she could with the equipment she had, the way bison had once moved across this same ground. Pulse grazing, high impact, quick departure, long rest. And she would do all of this without a dollar of input credit on the margins from a lease agreement on the East Quarter and whatever the cattle brought at auction. The first person to find out was her cousin Darren, who farmed 3 sections to the west and who stopped by on a Tuesday in April to see how she was getting on. He found her in the field with a walk-behind cedar, putting in a cover crop on the quarter section. She'd decided to rest from cash crop production entirely that year. He stepped out of his truck and looked at what she was doing for a long moment. "You're not putting in wheat?" he said. "Not this year. Cease." He used the nickname he'd used since they were kids, and the tone he said it in was not unkind, just deeply, genuinely puzzled. "That's a whole quarter sitting empty." "It's not empty. It's just growing something different." He looked at the seed bag. Hairy vetch, crimson clover, phacelia, radish, oats. "That's not a crop." "It is, just not one I'm going to sell." Darren pushed his cap back on his head. He had his father's hands, big and cracked along the knuckles, and he looked at her the way a good doctor looks at someone who has just said something concerning. Not dismissive, but worried. He said he hoped she knew what she was doing. He said if she needed anything, she knew where he was. He climbed back in his truck and drove away, and by the end of the week, Cecily had become the subject of a conversation at the co-op that she would only hear about secondhand, months later, from the woman who ran the post office. Apparently the consensus was that grief did things to people, that losing Raimi and then inheriting all that trouble had been too much for a girl from the city. She was from Saskatchewan. She had a degree in environmental science that she had put on a shelf when she took a desk job. She had left the desk job for this. People found this easy to explain as a kind of breakdown. The official skepticism arrived in the form of Mr. Warwick, the regional agrologist for the Provincial Ministry of Agriculture. He was a pleasant, competent man in his mid-50s who drove a clean government truck and wore good boots and who genuinely believed in what he was doing. He was not a villain. That is important to understand. He was a man who had spent 30 years helping farmers navigate an incredibly difficult business. And the tools that worked, the tools with evidence, with data, with decades of yield comparisons, were the tools he carried. He came because someone at the co-op had mentioned Cecily's situation. And he came because that was his job, and he did his job well. He walked the fields with her on a cold morning in early May. He listened. He was patient. And then he told her, carefully and with genuine concern, that what she was proposing was risky in ways she might not fully appreciate. No-till required specialized equipment she didn't have. Diverse cover crops sounded attractive, but the data on yield recovery timelines were variable. Rotational grazing could work, but 60 head on 400 acres was a very thin margin for error. He could connect her with financing. He knew the people at FCC. She could get herself a proper fertility program, get the fields back up to production standard in 2 to 3 years. And then, if she wanted to experiment with some of these alternative practices, do it from a position of financial stability rather than the edge of a cliff. He was right about some of it. She knew that. "Mr. Warwick," she said, standing at the edge of the field where the cover crop seed was barely beginning to push through the soil crust, pale and fragile and looking nothing like salvation. "My grandfather spent 40 years watching this land lose what it had. I've read every note he took. He knew something was wrong with the approach. He just didn't live long enough to try something different." "I'm going to try it." Mr. Warwick made a note on his clipboard. He looked at her with something she recognized as professional pity, which is a specific and particular kind of pity, worse in some ways than the ordinary kind. He said she knew where to reach him. He drove away. She would learn later that he'd mentioned her case at a regional agriculture extension meeting that fall, as an example, he said, of how grief and idealism could combine to push someone into decisions that felt meaningful but carried substantial risk. His colleagues had nodded. One of them had made a joke she was not there to hear. The other visitor that first spring was harder to dismiss. His name was Mr. Aldrich. She recognized it from the file because the name appears in the list. She'd inherited along with the farm a long-standing fertilizer supplier her grandfather had dealt with for 15 years. He came in a white pickup with a company logo on the door, and he had the easy manner of a man who has spent his career being welcomed into farmyards because he generally arrives with something people want. He did not mock. He was too experienced for that. His technique was something quieter and more effective. He sat at her kitchen table and drank the coffee she poured and talked about her grandfather, how much Remy had been respected in this area, what a good farmer he'd been, how hard it must be to carry all this forward alone. He talked about commodity markets and input costs and the very real danger of losing a farm to debt when a single bad harvest hit at the wrong moment. He said he understood she was interested in these newer approaches, the no-till, the cover crops, and he respected that. He did, truly, but he'd seen a lot of farms try to transition too fast, and the transition years were when people got into trouble. He could offer her a full input package on deferred payment terms. No money down until after harvest. She could run her experiment on a portion of the land, keep the rest productive, protect herself. It was a golden rope, and she could see the gold in it. It was not entirely a bad offer. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, "my grandfather's last notebook has an entry from the spring before he died. He wrote that he was tired of buying the same problem in a different bag every year." She looked at him steadily. "I don't think he was wrong." Mr. Aldrich's smile stayed where it was, but something behind it shifted. He was a man who had learned to read the moment when a sale was over. He stood up, gathered his papers, thanked her for the coffee. At the door he paused and said that if things got difficult, and they might, he wasn't trying to frighten her. Just being honest, the offer would stand. He drove away down the gravel road, and the dust hung in the still air for a long time after he was gone. She was alone with her decision. Let me tell you about Rémi Bouchard. He was not a man anyone would have called visionary. He had a grade 10 education and 50 years of calluses, and a way of looking at the sky before dawn that told him more than the weather app on his daughter's phone could tell her. He was a man shaped entirely by this specific piece of ground, its springs and its droughts, its particular cold, its particular mud. In his late years, as the farm got harder, he stopped farming as much and started watching. Cecily had thought at the time that he was slowing down. She understood later that he was learning. He walked the land in the evenings. He crouched and dug. He took notes about things no one told him to take notes about. The color change in the soil at the edge of the standing water after a rain. The difference in how the winter wheat came up in the years they'd had cattle grazing the stubble versus the years they hadn't. The strip along the north fence. Always the strip along the north fence. He had never taken a course in soil ecology. He had never heard the word mycorrhizal, but he had written in a notebook in 1994 a sentence that Cecily read so many times she had it memorized by February. The good ground feeds itself. We keep interrupting it. He had seen the pieces. He had not lived long enough to assemble them. That task had fallen to her, and she intended to honor it now. The first 2 years were hard in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't watched a plan. They believe in produce no visible results, while everyone around them produces visible results in the conventional way. The cover crop on the rested quarter grew up lush and green, and then she rolled it down in late summer and left it. It looked from the road like a field that had given up. Darren stopped by twice and said nothing, which she appreciated. The cash crop fields, the ones she was attempting to manage with reduced tillage and no synthetic fertility, came up pale and uneven that first year. Her yield on the winter wheat was 20% below county average. She knew it would be. She had planned for it. But knowing and experiencing are different things, and there were mornings that first fall when she stood on the porch in the dark before dawn and felt the weight of the gap between what she believed and what she could see. She had a particular bad afternoon in the second summer, a dry stretch in July. The wheat on the transitioning fields was shorter than her neighbors. The color, not quite the deep green it should have been. From the road, if you knew what you were looking at, you could see the difference. She drove into town for parts, and at the co-op she overheard, not meant for her, but not hidden either, a conversation between two men she knew by sight. One of them said her name. The other one laughed and said something about the university girl playing farmer. She drove home and sat in the kitchen for a long time. That evening she opened the notebooks, not looking for anything specific. Just sitting with them the way you sit with a person whose company you need, even if neither of you says much. She turned to the page with the north fence entry from 1987. She read it again. Ce champ-là, il se repose. This field is resting. She thought, so is mine. She closed the notebook, went to bed, and got up the next morning and kept going. The third year was when the land started to answer back. She found earthworms in the transitioning fields for the first time. Not a few, but populations of them, fat and active, moving through soil that was noticeably darker than it had been in her first year's photographs. The soil aggregate structure, the way the particles clumped together into stable crumbs rather than compacting into a hard crust after rain, had improved visibly. She was not imagining it. She dug with her hands and it felt different. There was a looseness, a life to it. The cash crop yield that year was still slightly below county average. But her input costs were a fraction of her neighbors. She had run no synthetic fertilizer. She had used no herbicide on 2 of the 4 fields, relying instead on the crop competition from the dense seeding rates her grandfather's notes had suggested. She calculated her net margin per acre. It was higher than it had been in year 1, and not far below what her neighbor Darren was netting after his input bills. She sent soil samples to the university again, sealed the return envelope without a name on it, just a box number. The results, when she picked them up, made her hands shake slightly at the box. Organic matter on the transitioning fields had climbed from under 1% to nearly 2%. Available nutrients were moderate, but the key number was at the bottom of the report, in the microbial activity section. The lab noted unusually high levels of biological activity and the presence of what appeared to be a recovering mycorrhizal population. The soil, in the language of the report, was rebuilding functional biology. Her grandfather's ground was waking up. The 4th and 5th years came and went with the quiet accumulation of evidence. A dry summer that hit the region hard in year 4 showed her something she had hoped for, but not been certain of. While her neighbor's fields, soil compacted by tillage, organic matter depleted, unable to hold water, went into drought stress quickly. Her transitioning fields showed a resilience she had not seen before. The soil held moisture longer. The wheat roots, drawing on the mycorrhizal networks now well re-established, went deeper. She irrigated less. Her neighbors ran their pivot systems around the clock. When the crop came off that fall, the numbers at the elevator told a story that people in the area found genuinely confusing. Cecily Bouchard, 43 bushels per acre on winter wheat. County average was 37. No synthetic fertility, minimal herbicide, lower water usage than any comparable operation in the region. The whispers at the co-op changed character. The laughter was gone. In its place was a particular silence. The silence of people who have been certain of something and have just encountered information that doesn't fit. Darren came over that October. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Mr. Aldrich had once made his offer, and he looked at her the way you look at someone when you realize you underestimated them and you're not quite sure what to do with that realization. "How?" he said. Just that. She poured him coffee and told him about the mycorrhizal networks, about the organic matter, about the north fence line, and what the soil there had done for itself over 20 years without anyone's help. She told him about their grandfather's notebooks. Darren had never read them. He hadn't known what was in them. He sat with that for a while. Then he said quietly, he tried to tell people that nobody listened much. "I know," Cecily said. It was 2 years after the good harvest, 7 years after she had walked into a field of pale soil and made a decision that most people around her thought was grief talking, that Mr. Aldrich's white pickup appeared on her road again. He was different. The polish was still there, but there was something beneath it that hadn't been there before. A tiredness, maybe, or the particular look of a man who has been revising his certainties. The company, he said, was expanding into what they were now calling regenerative transition programs. The market had shifted. Farmers were asking questions that his old product lines couldn't answer. He'd been hearing about her results for a couple of years now. He'd dismissed them at first. Good weather, good luck, a small sample size. But the consistency was hard to argue with. He sat in her kitchen again. He didn't bring a brochure this time. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out carefully, like something heavy being set down. "I came here 7 years ago with a program that I believed in, and I didn't listen to what you were actually telling me. I'm sorry for that." Cecily waited. "What you've built here," he said. "The soil biology, the structure. We've had agrologists walk your fields. They're talking about it at the ministry. They want to understand the system so they can help other farmers replicate it." My company would like to be part of that conversation. We could fund a demonstration project, a field school. Bring farmers from across the province out here to see it firsthand. You'd be compensated. It could become a real program. Have you ever been offered something that looks exactly like what you wanted? The recognition, the resources, the reach, and felt in the same breath that something essential would be lost the moment you reached for it. Cecily looked out the kitchen window at the north field. It was October. The cover crop she'd seeded after the wheat harvest was a wash of green and brown across the dark ground, and in the low morning light, you could see the faint shimmer of frost on the rolled stubble. It looked like something that had been here a very long time, long before she arrived, long before her grandfather arrived. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, "my grandfather didn't figure this out in a lab. He figured it out by watching one piece of ground for 50 years. The system works here because it grew out of here, out of this specific soil, this specific climate, these specific conditions. What you're describing is taking that and turning it into a product, and products get simplified, and the simplifications get sold, and somewhere along the way the part that actually matters gets lost in the package." Mr. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the field. "What you're saying," he said slowly, "is that it can't be franchised. I'm saying it shouldn't be. Other farmers can learn the principles, but the listening part, the watching part, that has to happen on their own land, in their own time. You can't sell someone a shortcut to paying attention." He nodded. Not the nod of agreement, exactly. The nod of a man who has come seeking something he realizes now he cannot carry home. He left. The white pickup went down the road, and the dust settled slowly in the October air. Years move differently on land you love, fast in the way that all time moves fast, slow in the way that seasons teach you to count things differently. Not by months, but by first frost and first thaw, by the particular shade the field goes in August heat, by the smell of the soil after the first real October rain. By the time the farm had been in Cecily's hands for 15 years, it had grown from 400 acres to nearly 900. Not through predation. Her neighbor to the east, an older man named Bernard, who had been farming with a debt load that had become unpayable, had sold to her at a price that was fair and that she had spent 2 years saving for. His fields were compacted and pale and nutrient depleted from decades of conventional management. She spent 4 years bringing them back. Darren came over regularly now. He had started leaving one field a year to transition on his own operation. He phoned her with questions. She answered them, always with a reference to a specific notebook page, a specific observation her grandfather had made. The notebooks had become, in her kitchen, a kind of working document, annotated now in her own hand alongside the cramped French of the original. If you were to visit that land today, you would find a woman in her early 40s, her hands rougher than they looked at 26, her knowledge deeper than any program had given her. She walks her fields the way her grandfather walked them, not to inspect them, exactly, but to be in conversation with them. She has a way of stopping in the middle of a row and crouching down and taking a handful of soil, bringing it close, reading it. It is a habit she didn't learn from a manual. It came from watching him, on the desk in the farmhouse, the same desk where Rémi Bouchard once kept his accounts. There are 2 stacks of notebooks, his worn and soft with handling, the covers faded, hers newer, already accumulating their own particular wear. The handwriting is different, but the subject is the same. What this specific ground does, in this specific season, under these specific conditions. The record of a long conversation between a family and its land. She will pass them on eventually. There is a young woman in the area, a daughter of a family that sold out in the 90s and moved to Regina, who comes out to help with the cattle work sometimes. She has the kind of quiet attention that Cecily recognizes, the way a person looks at the ground when they think no one is watching. She has started asking questions, the right questions, the ones that begin with why rather than how much. Cecily is patient with her. She shows her things rather than telling her. She has her dig with her hands. She has her smell the soil, compare what it does in different places, ask herself what it might mean. She does not explain mycorrhizal networks until the young woman has already noticed that something is different in the network, has already felt it in her hands and smelled it in the dark earth, and arrived at the edge of the question herself. That is the way it was passed to Cecily, not as information but as a way of looking. The story of this farm is not complicated. The men with the degrees and the company trucks looked at 400 acres of struggling Saskatchewan land and saw a math problem. They saw inputs and outputs, a yield equation to be optimized, a farmer who needed to be brought back to the correct methodology. They offered her the same answer that was failing the land, packaged in different terms at different price points. Cecily Bouchard, guided by the cramped French marginalia of a man who never graduated high school, looked at the same land and saw a relationship that had been damaged. She saw a system that had been interrupted long enough to forget what it was capable of. She understood that the recovery was not a product you could purchase. It was a process you had to earn season by season by showing up and paying attention and being willing to look foolish while the land was still deciding whether to trust you. They all wondered what she was doing out there, crouching in the dirt, reading soil the way her grandfather read weather. But the ground remembered, and when it was ready, it told her everything.